Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that began just when the stupid pandemic began. And Jenna Blum and I started it to help independent bookstores whose doors were shuttered by the pandemic, authors whose tours were canceled, including mine, and readers who just want to have some relationship with writers. And I also want to tell everybody that this Monday, the Blaze is actually having an online party on Tuesday for, you will see the advertisements up. I put there's something else up there. So you can join, and there's going to be swag and prizes. So do come. So today we have a book, Small World, by Laura Zigman. And this book is racking up a huge amount of raves. The Washington Post says the novel is as poignant as it is funny, as thought-provoking as it is witty, and searingly relatable. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune says Zigman's tenderly told novel is a realistic rendering of what it's like to care for and love a disabled child, and the toll that that love takes on parents and siblings. It's also about the bonds that sisters share and how, in the case of the Mellishmans, unresolved grief nearly breaks them. But it's laced with the promise of a brighter future. And the New York Times book review says a graceful swan dive into the question of how a family rearranges itself after the death of a child. In Zigman's entrancing latest, two sisters confront the childhood death of their middle sister, Eleanor. Lydia and her sister were neglected by their parents because they had to focus on their sister Eleanor, who was severely disabled and who died from the flu at 10. This propelled the mother, Louise, into working for children with special needs and into perhaps working for the children more than she was paying attention to her own living kids. So it's actually an amazing book about what we do and don't do for love in a lot of ways. So first of all, I want to welcome you, Laura. I'm thrilled to have you here. Love your book. We all love you at the Blaze. We're all excited to have you here. What was haunting you into writing this book? Tell us the origin story.
Well, Caroline, I'm really happy to be here, and I love the Blaze too, and I love you too. I felt like this was one of those stories that I had wanted to tell my whole life. I think we all have a story that we feel we need to tell, if both because we feel it will explain us to other people, and in the telling of it, we'll know ourselves more. And I always wanted to tap our real family story, which is that I had a sister who died when she was 7 and I was 3, and my older sister was 5. So my sister Linda and I, who lives in California, we grew up in a family that had lost a child before we were really aware of it. We were so young. She didn't really live with us very long. And so we didn't feel it was our loss. It was our parents' loss. And it changed them forever, as of course it does. And I thought at one point I might try to write it as a memoir, but I tried that and wrote a whole bunch of stuff, but it just didn't seem like enough to carry its own story. In that straightforward memoir way. So eventually when I started this book, I thought it would be a really comical book about two sisters who move in together as adults. They're both divorced, no kids. And they're living together. One sister moves back from the West Coast and moves into her sister's Cambridge apartment. And how funny would that be? Like sisters at our age, sometimes we don't really know each other, and
right.
We think we're mature, and then we're together for 5 seconds and we're at each other's throats and we regress. And so I thought this would be so funny. And then as I started to write it, I realized it was the perfect setup to explore this other thing. And I was able to use some of the material I had written, very fictionalized, because obviously the story that you summarized so well is that Eleanor, their middle sister, in the novel, Eleanor lives at home for almost all of her 10 years, 9 of her 10 years. And then she's institutionalized only for 1 year. And it's after that 1 year she gets the flu. She dies at Fernald, which we'll talk about in a minute. But
right.
And so it was very different from my upbringing, and I wanted to really explore what that's like, because I feel too, as parents, if we are parents, we always feel, even if we're doing a good job, we're failing in some other way.
I know.
Someone's always going to lose. And when you're dealing with a special needs child or the grief of a death of a child, most people are just absolutely doing their best. They're focused on the child that needs the most help. And the well children, as they're called now, there's a term called well child syndrome. And those are the children who are well. There was no term like this when I was growing up, but this is
no, me either.
Like, and then the other children who are okay, kind of have to fend for themselves, because so much of the parents' attention is understandably so focused on the child with needs. And so, but all kids have needs. And, even if your parents are doing their best, especially in this case, Louise was completely devoted to Eleanor and the concept of inclusion. She wanted her included in everything. And she was a disability advocate. And before Eleanor died, she was an advocate too. But after she died, she became much more of an advocate too. And so the irony, of course, is that she was fighting for inclusion for Eleanor while the other two were sort of
excluded. This is totally fascinating, because what you actually did so brilliantly was you sort of took one of your own traumas, which maybe you hadn't explored that much. And because you hadn't explored it because you were so little and your sister wasn't living at home. But what you did is you created a situation where you could explore it, and where you could, as writers, when we're writing, we're living that and we're feeling that. So therefore, in order to heal, you re-remembered almost your own trauma through this person, Eleanor, which, that's what every writer hopes to do. And you did that brilliantly. So I wanted to ask you, when you were doing that, did any of those old feelings that you yourself had sort of bubble to the surface, and you thought, oh, I have to deal with this now?
I felt like I had, yes. And yet I also felt like, because I was fictionalizing it so much, it was tapping into all the feelings. And some of those feelings were that my whole life, and I'll only speak for myself, not for my sister, but my whole life, I really felt like I didn't feel entitled to my feelings, because I felt sorry for my parents. I felt like they had been, sad, and they had experienced this loss. And how can you blame them? How can you blame people? And so when you're the child growing up in that kind of situation, and there are far worse situations to grow up in, we're talking about an emotional feeling of benign neglect, really. And it was the 70s, so there was benign neglect or neglect.
Right. Everybody.
The 70s, we all know the jokes, no seatbelts, no everything.
Right.
But, so most of my life, I felt, I think, a really kind of secret anger. And it's funny, because I lived in, I came from Boston, and then I moved to New York and DC, and then I ended up coming back to Newton, where I grew up. It was kind of like not planned that I would move back, but I had so much time to explore the institution where my sister lived, Fernald, which was this institution in Waltham, Mass, and which is in the book, where Eleanor is for 1 year. I had so many years, from 2001, for years, I could have driven over there. My parents were alive. I could have asked them questions, but I was so defiant, like privately defiant. I was like, no, I've spent my life living in the shadow of this thing. I'm not going over there. I'm not interested. I'm so nosy about everything. I will Google anything within an inch of his life, but yet I never went. I never drove over there until I think it was 2015, and they had already shut it down. And I got onto the campus, if you can call it that anymore, and it was all shut down. It was in the process of being really shuttered. So now it looks like an abandoned, terrifying. But at the time, it was just shut down, and I was so upset that I couldn't go into the buildings. I had waited too long, but that's life. You're only ready when you're ready. And both my parents were gone. So there were all these questions I had that I couldn't ask. And so fiction was the perfect way to explore those things, because there's a lot of scenes in the book. There's one set in a amusement park that never happened. Our sister was gone, and we never took her to the amusement park. But we went there every summer. And so it was easy to just, you know what it's like. you can just draw on.
Yeah. An
entirely fictional scene of what it would have been like. What would it have been like? And the parents in the book are very different from my parents. And, but the emotional feelings, all that stuff is really real.
It's right there.
Great to explore it.
It's so visceral. I just want to stop to tell anybody out there listening, please post your comments in the comments in the comments section. We'll get to it. And also go to bookshop.org or your favorite indie and buy Laura Zigman's book, Small World. And actually, while you're there, why not pick up all of her books, because they're all wonderful. Okay, so back to this. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the portrait of Eleanor, because I feel like she's so vivid on the page. I wanted to know, how did you go about crafting such an extraordinary portrait of her? Did you do research, or did it just sort of flow out? Tell us about that process.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard because my first draft, I think there wasn't much detail to her. My editor read it and just said, she's there, but she's not there. You know, you need to give
Okay.
her something. You need to give her as much of something that someone who is really not verbal and doesn't speak. And, you know, you need to give her, they have to connect with her in some way that's not just like she's just in a, you know, she's here, she's there.
Right,
So that was
right,
really
right.
challenging. I did some research, and I also just, I mean, I've known a lot of people with kids who have various, I mean, I grew up around it because after my sister died in 1965, my parents really stayed in that community, the Fernald community. And most of their friends were in our lives for a really long time because their kids grew up. I mean, they were in their 20s at the time. They, you know, they were, and they grew up, they lived probably into their 60s. And so we remained in that community. So I was very used to seeing all kinds of people, and I was very comfortable around people with disabilities and various things. So I just used my imagination either from memory, or I did of course do some research, but you know, disabilities vary so much that you can really almost make up how you want it to be. And you know, in this case, I've known enough to know that it felt right. It felt right enough. But you never
It
know.
felt
Yeah.
It felt exactly right. Also, the whole thing about what it's like to lose a child was, it was exactly right. It just felt so right there. And I think that, I don't know, as I was reading it, I had this one thought where I thought, oh my God, Eleanor is giving Laura permission to write this. It just felt like you tapped into something, um, which was kind of extraordinary.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit more about Fernal, because you and I spoke about it before, because I had actually worked there when I was in high school, and it was a terrifying, disastrous, horrific place. And when you called me to ask about it, I remember I got that same feeling of just visceral terror. Like, what a place. Were you able to speak to any people who had been at Fernal, or parents of people who had put kids there?
Yeah, it's funny, you know, that was its reputation, and it certainly was real. I mean, you're right. I mean, you worked there, you saw it from the inside. When my sister was there from probably 1960 to 65, she was in a medical building, which was a little bit
Okay,
different than
okay,
perhaps the other buildings, and much later on. However, and my parents always spoke very high, you know, they visited very frequently. They were very friendly with the nurses. They always had just only compliments for the care she got. And again, she was in a medical building. She had a very rare medical condition.
right.
So that was different. But it's funny, when I got I mean, of course I knew you, but I never knew you worked at Fernald. And when I started to really dig into this topic, I got to know somebody in Boston. His name was Alex Green, and he teaches at
Alex Green. He's great.
Harvard Kennedy School, and he writes for the, you know, writes for the Globe and everything. And he's actually at work on a big biography of Walter E. Fernald. But we got to be very friendly, and he put me in touch with you. And then he also put me in touch with a guy named Bob Coleman, who's given many interviews. So I'm not saying anything that he hasn't already said publicly. But he put me in touch with Bob, and we had a phone conversation. The most incredible thing was, Bob came from a big family, and one of his brothers was, as the parlance of the day, he was retarded. That's the term that was used back
That's
then.
what they called it.
Yeah, developmentally disabled. And so his brother
Right.
was at, and his brother was in the same building as my sister Cheryl was.
Wow.
And so he knew exactly almost the same years that she was. I mean, it was uncanny to be able to speak to someone who went and visited. And so I asked him a million questions, but I mean, and he's given many interviews. And one of the really amazing visuals that he told me was, you know, I said, what was it like when you visited? And he described how they would drive over on Sunday afternoons, and the mom, you know, they had a station wagon full of kids, and the mom would go up into the building, and they would all stay in the car. And then she would bring their brother over to there was a big window, one of those giant windows. And she would bring the brother over to the window and they'd wave down to the car. And then she'd finish her visit and she'd come down and the father would go up. And that's how they visited. And of course, as he got older and when the weather was better and everything, they would meet outside, and he's lived in different buildings after that. But it was just incredible to meet someone who's
It's incredible. Yeah, it's still there. Well, that place is still potent. I mean, I used to go back to when my mom was alive. She lived right near Fernal. And every time we would drive past, you still look at it and think about, well, what happened there and what happened to those people and how are they now? Okay, so let's turn to some humor. Let's talk about the hilarious online site Small World and what Joyce is doing there and why. And if you do that yourself in some way.
Of course I do. So Small World is the sort of Nextdoor site. I think we all know what Nextdoor is. It's that neighborhood site.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine, I totally stole the idea. A friend of mine used to do this. He would take posts from his listserv, who lives in Baltimore, and he would just cut the little paragraph into poems and post them on Facebook and just be like, and it was brilliant, and I loved them, and I ended up not knowing how it would fit into the story, but I had Joyce become really obsessed with Small World, which is their version of a neighborhood site, and she just goes down the rabbit hole all the time because it's the perfect way for her to sort of, engage, because all those posts are like people having little problems and issues and questions. And it's a way to sort of engage if you're lonely also with other people without having to go outside, So you post and then someone answers you. And then sometimes there's a whole thread and fights and, like that. And can be deeply annoying, but she loves these, like there's lost cats and there's, bad turkeys, stay away from the street, the turkeys are here. So who stole my avocados? There's all that stuff. And those are really funny to, I spent a lot of time trolling Nextdoor because, as you know, as a writer, there's nothing better than procrastinating.
There's nothing better. That's right.
So whenever I was stuck on the plot, I would just go, oh, I can look at Nextdoor. So I still get I still look, in case I ever need them. But I spent a lot of time and I had all these different topics, lost this and, this and that. And then what really surprised me on the site, though, is that there were so many posts that really had no issue. They were just people writing these really long messages that lonely, they're lonely.
Yes.
And they walks in the neighborhood and they would write these really long things. And so my first draft of the novel used the actual post from Nextdoor. Actually, I didn't change a word, and I sent the manuscript in and my editor was like, oh, love the poems. And I said, I love the poems too. And then she was like, and I said, yeah, they're word for word from Nextdoor, which I just was so proud of because I felt like the verisimilitude of like, these are real. I didn't change a word. Look how funny. And she was like, I can't do that. And I was like, oh.
I was going to say, yeah.
Oh, of course I can't. Yeah. But so I changed. I mean, I had to sort
of. But they're hilarious. They're absolutely hilarious. But I have another question about Small World. But before that, I have to circle back to, it's sort of the same thing where we were talking about this before we got on. You used to run this hilarious series called Annoying Questions that people should look up because it was sort of real things that people would say. Often it was with writers, where the writer would be sitting there and somebody would say, I don't think I've ever heard of you. Do you really write books? Or I know you said you were reviewed in the New York Times, but do you mean the New York Times in New York? Or is it someplace else? And it goes on with this sort of deadpan conversation. It's hilarious, hilarious, hilarious. So I wonder if you could, this seems to hook into the whole thing with the small words kind of stuff. I wonder if this means that you're probably just an intrepid eavesdropper as well, right?
So nosy.
That's what I That's what because there's a lot of humor in what people say to you and what they ask, and there's no sort of realization that what they ask might be deeply offensive or provocative. But anyway, I urge everybody to go and look it up on YouTube. It's really funny. All right, back to Small Worlds. beside the online site, I love the whole idea of the small world where, in fact, we're taking care of the sister Eleanor. They felt that their world was just small and contained, but actually there was so much emotion in it that it was enlarged. And also in their adulthood, these sisters can also enlarge their worlds by facing their past. Am I just blowing steam, or
No, I
is that
think
part of your
that's
intent? I mean, I just had this feeling of their worlds are so much bigger now and so
yeah,
much better.
yeah. Well, they're stuck, I mean, it was not a COVID. I wrote it during COVID, but it doesn't take place during COVID. But you get to a certain age. They're both. Neither of them had kids. Neither Joyce nor Lydia had
Right.
kids by design. They're both divorced, and so they're not really looking for love right now. They're just trying to they're trying to figure out the rest of their lives, and they just happen to
Right.
be stuck in the
Their
same
place,
apartment. Yeah.
their place in the
So
world. It it's interesting to me too that Joyce is an archivist, because what she's doing isn't just archiving the past of her sisters, both of them, but she's kind of trying to archive her own past and make sense of that. And what I was thinking, that as she's doing that, as she's changing, the way she's thinking about her past is changing too, and in a way that changes the past too. Do you think that that's true?
yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point because her job, she's a archivist for a company that, when you find a whole bunch of stuff, your family photos or films, and you need to digitize the old movies or the video cassettes or the VHS stuff, or institutions that have a whole collection of stuff. That's the company, and so she specializes in like the family stuff, and so she's fascinated because coming from a sad family,
Right.
she is fascinated, and she sees other people's families, and they're skiing and they're boating and they're doing all this fun stuff. And
Right.
she kind of resents the fact that they're so carefree and often very careless, and they kind of court danger, and they didn't. She feels they didn't have the luxury in her family of doing stuff like that. They had this child who had a really serious disability, set of disabilities, and they had to be really careful, and they weren't carefree. And she's jealous in a way, so that is part of her, but she's always looking at other people's families. And I think we all grew up in our
We all
own
do that.
sad way. I mean, some people have more sadness and less sad, but I remember, you kind of think your family's just the way families are, and then there's always a moment when you realize, oh, not everyone grew up like this. Not everyone
Right.
grew up like death as being a topic of conversation. Like, that's how I grew up. It
Right.
was just always so morose. I mean, whether it was we were talking about Cheryl or someone else's, we're also Jews. So, a lot of
A
death.
lot of that. That's a Jewish thing, definitely. That was in my family.
Right.
um,
But, yeah.
let's talk about that a little more, because a lot of people have commented on how great it is that there was so much humor among the sorrow, which I also loved. So I wanted to know, is that your personal way of living, to find something bright in the darkness, to be able to continue? And if so, how do you do that? I mean, I would like directions to do that.
Yeah, it's really hard because, you're trying to tell a story and you want to give it enough heft and depth, but you're also like, oh my God, is this so grim that no one's going to want to read
Right.
it? And
Right.
that was really hard because there were moments when I was writing the backstory stuff. And I thought, I don't know. I don't know if this is going to work because it might just be too much. It might just be too, like, who wants to read this, or this might be too sad. And then it was really fun to balance that with the
Right.
sisters because they were so, there was so much humor in it, even though that also gets serious too. Because when you put yourself with a sibling, you can't help, that initial politeness and that sense that you guys get along, and then you have a shared history, and you laugh about the past, haha, and then it turns really quickly with most families. It gets, if there's any pain, and most families, there's some pain, there's some issues um, that resurface, and you both regress. It can get really ugly really fast, and it's all comes from like those real deep childhood wounds, and
Right.
it's really common. but it happens, and you're just like, so I just love the idea that these two sisters, were going to come back together. They've never been that close. They've never really lived in the same place. They don't even really know each other that well. They've seen each other over the years, but not like when you live in the same place.
Right.
So they're essentially strangers in a certain way. And then they have all this shit from their childhood that they've never quite gotten over individually. And they've also never really talked about. And so, there's this fantasy we all have that we're going to be super close to our families and our siblings. And
yeah.
and sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes you hit a rough spot, and you become close again. So it just, I wanted to really kind of show that you can hit that really rough spot, and then you can also, find.
You did it really beautifully. And I never thought, oh, this book is grim, because not just because of the humor, but because of the way the sisters were changing. So it felt to me like they were earning the moments of grace. It wasn't just given to them. So, somebody also mentioned in a review that what was wonderful was that the book was talking about the things that bring comfort and grace, the unexpected things. And I loved that. And I wanted to know if you could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like, I turned 60 this summer, and I still can't quite believe that I am. But I feel like, when you get to be a certain age, and I mean, I've sort of felt this way for a while, but especially now, like, what feels like a reward and a gift is very different than what felt like a reward and a gift.
Right.
When I was 30 or 40, you have a whole different set of expectations and goals. I mean, now it's like by the time you're 60, you're so beaten down. You've had so much failure. You've had so much loss. You've had so much, good stuff, but also just like so much stuff happens, over the years. You get used to a certain so that it's such a balm. The small things are so important. I mean, I don't want this, and I don't want that, and I don't, but so what we really crave are those moments of like transformation, when you can repair a relationship or deepen a relationship that was not deep before, that you can come to an understanding and see the person who feels unseen, and you feel seen by the person. Lydia and Joyce were ignored really their entire childhood by their parents. I mean, and you can say, well, it's not their fault, but that's how they felt. They felt unseen and invisible, and they went through their lives that way, and they probably went through their marriages that way, and now they're together, and they still feel that way, and they're at each other because who has more, who's getting more attention, or who's getting to know the people upstairs. Why are you getting to know the people upstairs? I'm jealous. Now I want to be. It's
right.
Siblings like that who have that thing. And so if you can be generous to the other person, because your tendency is just to be like, I hate you.
Yes, that's like true.
I mean, and now it's like, if you can just be generous and see what the other person is struggling with, and they can see, and then if you do it to them, they will do it to you most of the time. So
is your sister also a writer?
No, it's funny. She's a painter.
So she's a painter. Okay, so it's still creative. Okay.
A little bit similar to the book. She went to RISD. She's really talented. And then she left. She's same thing. She went to California and never came back, and loves it there. And I'm, happy she loved it there. But we have never lived in the same coast since a long time ago. Part of it is like imagining what it would be like. Yeah.
That's so interesting, because I was going to ask you, like, why one sister was on California West Coast, the other was the East Coast, and now that makes perfect, absolute sense. Yeah. Tell us about you as a kid. When did you want to be a writer, and what was that journey like?
I grew up in that kind of time when, like, it was before computers, it was before everything, and I wanted to do a lot of things. Like, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and then I hit the math thing. Can't do that. And then I wanted to be this. Like, oh, can't. Got terrible scores on my SATs. Can't be a lawyer. And so the only thing that I really felt like I could do was waitress and write. Those were my two things. So I thought, well, so I went to UMass, and then I took the Radcliffe publishing course. Like, And then I thought I would stay in, we all thought we were going to stay in Boston and all work at Little Brown. All of us, like the Mary Tyler Moore thing, like the 10 of us were going to
Right, right. Throw your hat in the air.
one job there. Somebody got it. So everyone else went to New York and I followed, and I ended up working in book publishing for 10 years. And I never went to New York thinking I'm going to just get a little apartment and write. I was like, oh my God, I need a job. I always had a job with benefits. And then I wrote in my spare time because I never felt. And then I went to graduate school I went for an MFA and I dropped out after 2 days. So that didn't work out. Came back.
Wait. Why did you drop out after 2 days? That's a story.
Oh, you hated it. I got there and, well, this is, how things work. But I left New York, and right before I left New York, I fell in love with somebody. And I was like, oh, perfect timing. Like, I'm leaving New York and now now I just met this person. And so I moved to Boston because my MFA program was at BU. And we had this great love affair thing. And then classes started and I just was like, I knew instantly, this is not for me. I mean, no offense. It just wasn't right for me. And I ended up, telling everybody, and back then it was on the telephone. You actually had to call people on the real landline.
Oh,
and all
God.
my friends were like, oh, well, give it some time. And I said, okay. And they said, give it a semester. I was like, I'm giving it until Thursday, which I did. And I had 2 days and I left. And then I came back to New York. And then the person I was in love with, who said he was in love with me, dumped me. And so that became, animal husbandry basically was born from that experience, which I guess was worth it. But so
that's hilarious.
I did the thing where like I would send stuff to New Yorker, rejection, would send stuff to Cosmopolitan, rejection. I never got really published. I got published once by Gordon Lish, who was kind of this big figure in publishing, but it led nowhere. Nothing ever led anywhere for me. I mean, even if I got one little thing, nothing happened. So then I finally left New York after 10 years and I moved to DC and I got like a government job at the Smithsonian. I was home every day at 5:20 and I took out my novel. I had a draft of it and I revisited it and I was able to finish it, redo it and finish it. And I got really lucky because it became like the very beginning of chick lit, even though I don't like that term. It was really this, a lot of women, Jane Green, lots of people, Helen Fielding, we were all writing. It's a collective consciousness. Women were getting married later. We were all working career gals, and we were single. And so we were all kind of writing the same thing at the same time. And of course they slapped the label on it. But so I just
labels are marketing decisions.
Yeah, whatever.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever. Ollie, do we have any questions for Laura? I have more questions if we do. Oh, great. If walking a mile in someone else's shoes means you can understand them, do you think writing a novel to interrogate other perspectives is as close as you can get?
I mean, I think we're just all really curious. And if you can, I don't know if I would say interrogate, but you can really kind of look at other people's lives and try to understand them, then you want to get inside someone else's life and see it from their perspective. So, this is sort of the inside of mine, just in, a very fictionalized version. I feel like I knew this story or this feel of this story so well. And it also was very clear to me that this was not a parent's story. It was a sibling story, which is very different. I'm not a parent who lost a child, thank God. And so I'm not telling that story. So I was tempted to show it to some people who had either lost a child or parents with special needs kids. And I thought, it's not theirs. It's actually a very different
story. Right. It's a different story.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting thing. When you're showing your work to other people, you have to be, this is for writers out there, you have to be really careful who you show it to. Like if you wrote I wrote a book about an open adoption, made the mistake of showing it to a person who had an adoption gone wrong, and her comments were they weren't helpful at all, and they were also really debilitating for me.
Yeah.
So I can understand.
Writers out there have to be really careful who you show it to. Right. You can lose 2 years if you show it to
them. Yeah, you can. That's right. That's exactly right. Ollie, another question. Any other movies or TV series coming from your books?
Funny you should ask. Well,
great.
Has been optioned. for television. So it was optioned, and it was just renewed. The option was just renewed, so that's good news. Who knows if it will happen, but we hope. So it was optioned by the actress, the amazing actress Julianne Nicholson, who's been in a million different things. She's from Boston, and the company, the production company Whip. So when they optioned it back in the beginning of 2021, in the cold, gray January, like right now, they were telling us about what they're doing and everything, and we loved her. She's great and she's so wonderful and like a normal person, actual normal person. And they said, yeah, we just finished this thing and it's going to be on HBO in a couple months. And we were like, yeah, okay, great. And they said it was Mayor of Easttown, and so I was writing it down like Mayor of Easttown. Is that with 2 T's? And we had no idea that like 2 months later, Mayor of Easttown was this. I think it was the biggest.
Right, it was wonderful.
Whatever their metrics are, and so that's the team. It's Whip and Julianne Nicholson. They did, Mayor of Easttown, and they're on for this. And so we were very hopeful that something happens because she's so great, and they've hired a really great like director and a writer, and that's all we know. So fingers crossed.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
More questions, Ollie. Can you tell us about your writing therapy business? Wow, I didn't know you had one. How did I miss that? Tell me.
I do. I have a little business called Talk Therapy for Your Writing. So it's for writers who talk about their writing. So I was blocked for over 10 years. I had a terrible writer's block. And I wrote little things here and there, but nothing. I just couldn't write another novel. And I ghost wrote, but I couldn't write my own stuff. And I finally got through that block and wrote Separation Anxiety. Now I feel like I'm on the road. I'm back on the road. But I learned a lot, and I feel like because of my experience, I worked in publishing for 10 years as a publicist. So I really know kind of the business of publishing. And as a writer, as a novelist who was then blocked for so long, I know that side of things. And I was a ghostwriter. So I really am very skilled at extracting people's narratives out of them and sort of seeing the picture. Like, tell me what you want to do. A lot of times people have problem with plot. A lot of times people have trouble. Either they're blocked or they're halfway through a novel and they're stuck, or they are having an issue with their publisher or their agent. And there's very few people to talk to. I mean, you can complain to your friends, which is your writer friends, and they understand. And you can talk to your therapist, but your therapist doesn't really I'm the writing therapist. So if you're having a problem, you did talk to me. So that's, we can get to the issue and figure out how to move you forward in your work, or, help you just think through, do you need another agent? Why? What is not working for you? What are you looking for? Help you think through those pieces of the business parts that I understand, really well from personal experience. So I love doing it. I work with a lot of people. Sometimes it's one session, sometimes it's once a week, and people we're all in the same boat. We're all facing those challenges, either with our own actual work or the business. And you have to shut the business out while you're writing, which is really hard.
Right, which is really, really hard to do. What's the website for that?
It's on my website. My website's laurazigman.com.
Oh, it's laurazigman.com. Okay. Everybody should definitely visit that. That's such a genius idea.
By the hour. You don't have to commit. You don't have to buy a package. You don't have to
I love it.
Have a session. You want more? We'll do it again. No pressure. Like if you need one, like that. And
that's excellent. Really that's excellent. Do we have time for one last question? Probably. Do we have one, Ollie? Okay. Otherwise, then I'll have my traditional question that I ask every time, which is, what's obsessing you now and why?
What's obsessing me now? Okay, so normally I would say I'm still obsessed with Nextdoor and all that, and true crime. I'm actually obsessed. I don't have the book in front of me. I'm actually obsessed with this memoir. I'm actually going to see him tonight in Cambridge. So it's this memoir called Life on Delay, Making Peace with a Stutter. It's a memoir by John Hendrickson, and he's
I just read about that. That looks so good.
He wrote this big piece about Joe Biden's stutter back when Joe Biden was running for president, and no one really knew he had a stutter. And John Hendrickson himself has a stutter. and had never really admitted to himself that he had it. He never Googled it, never this, never that, until he wrote this piece about Joe Biden, and the piece completely went viral. And he ended up going on MSNBC and doing a live interview with Stephanie Ruhle, and stuttered his way through it, of course. And it was the first time he actually had. Anyway, people came from everywhere to write to him, stutterers who just were so moved by his piece. And he wrote back to all of them, and it's a reported memoir, so it's partly his own story. And then he spoke to a lot of people, researchers and other people with stutters. And it's one of the most moving books. It's a beautiful memoir, and he's doing these events. I implore you to go. I'm going. I can't wait. And I've watched them online, but the room is packed with people. A lot of stutterers come and they ask questions, and it's just the most moving thing, because it's just an incredible. It's very moving. So I am obsessed with that. I'm obsessed with the feeling created at those kinds of events. I think we are so hungry for compassion, empathy,
and compassion,
sense of just like this beautiful sense of like, wow, it's so moving that I feel like he's doing this incredible thing. He's going across the country to do these events.
Incredible. That's incredible.
So brave, so brave. Yeah.
Okay, then. So first I want to thank everybody who came up here. Please go to bookshop.org to buy Laura's books, or you can walk to your favorite indie bookstore and buy Laura's books. Don't forget that Mighty Blaze is having a party, and everybody is invited. And it is, I had to look it up. It is on Monday, the 23rd. It's around, I think it's like 7 o'clock or so. You'll have to go to the Mighty Blaze page to see the actual invitation, but there's swag, there's presents, there's surprises, and everybody from the Blaze is going to try to be there and act like the total lunatics we are. So come. Okay, and I also want to thank Ollie, our tremendous producer, Ollie Martin. Thank you. And most of all, I want to thank Laura Zigman, first for this gorgeous book, Small World by Laura Zigman, and also just for, this was a great interview. I learned so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline. Thanks for talking to me when I was researching it. Thanks, Ollie.
Thanks of course. And I guess that's it. We'll see you all next week.